Improvisation in jazz represents what many people consider to be the highest level of artistic expression. To do it, you have to invent musical ideas from your mind and then translate them onto your instrument, which takes an incredible amount of technical prowess as well as understanding of the inner workings of music. But why is it so hard? Why is it that so many of us feel like we can learn and play the solo of a master like Charlie Parker or a legend like Sonny Rollins, and we can even learn the theory of all the notes and the harmony going on, yet when we try to attempt an improvisation of our own, it just doesn't sound right? Is it because we just don't know enough licks? And if jazz improvisation is just a bunch of premeditated licks, is it really even improvisation? So that's what I'm going to try to clarify today. We're going to examine the roots of the music as well as sources and theory behind a set of licks. Then we're going to examine whether it's enough to just improvise with a set or pool of licks that we bring together. Can you make a solo out of just licks, and will that sound convincing? And will that really be improvisation? So most of you watching this video probably already know who I am, but in case you don't already, I've toured the world as a jazz soloist for over 10 years now. I've featured on 2 Grammy-winning albums, and for 5 years I was on faculty at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music as a visiting artist. I've also been fortunate enough to perform with a bunch of my heroes like Chris McBride, Arturo Sandoval, Chris Botti, Randy Brecker, Clarence Penn, and nowadays, whenever I'm home in New York, I dedicate my life to further practicing, studying, and teaching the art of improvisation here on YouTube and through my publishing company, Jazz Lesson Videos. That company supports all the free content that we put out on YouTube here. Our resources have been downloaded by over 50,000 musicians worldwide, and the feedback we get from that has ranged from kids receiving scholarships to college jazz programs with the help of our material to adults who have gotten back into music after a career in something else like electrical engineering. And thanks to getting back into the shed, they're first starting to gig more successfully with the help of our content. Now, speaking of success with materials on jazz, let's dive deeper into the topic of today. Can you become a high-level improviser? Just going to the source of the music, learning a bunch of licks and understanding how they all function, can you take that? Will that be enough to then improvise on your own? For instance, a lot of people have trouble bridging that gap, going from taking licks and bringing it into their own improvisation. So maybe we can demystify that today. And to fully answer this question, let's first consider, how did jazz improvisation start? Well, musicians from the ragtime era like Scott Joplin and Jelly Roll Morton started embellishing their written arrangements of music and creating spontaneous melodies when they would perform. Similar to the way that Bach and Beethoven improvised themselves, but what was different about ragtime from classical music was the feeling of the rhythm of the music as well as the harmony, which came out of work songs and gospel music from Black American slaves. Eventually, the music started to become recorded more, and many jazz musicians and historians look to early Louis Armstrong recordings as being the foundation of this music going into the swing era, as many of Louis's predecessors like Buddy Bolden were never actually recorded. So if Louis Armstrong is one of the early founders of jazz improvisation, and if the foundation of improvised jazz is embellishing and creating spontaneous melodies, let's look to a song that Louis made famous in the early days of swing for our first source material here. Let's check out a lick from the song Struttin' with Some Barbecue, which was actually written by his pianist and wife, Lil Hardin Armstrong. So again, what we're going to do here is we're going to take a bunch of source material from legends, we're going to observe that source material, do some variations of it, and we're going to pool together a bunch of licks that we're going to see if we can actually create a coherent solo with. So Struttin' with Some Barbecue starts with some material that sounds like this. Essentially, it's just a quick little major 7 arpeggio that starts on the 7th, and then you can play up 1, 3, 5, 7 from there. So this is just one example of how you could use an arpeggio to create cool little riffs. With that in mind, let's look at a bunch of different ways you can create riffs from an arpeggio, and we'll expand on our available source material here, adding to what we can use later in the solo when we create the solo with licks. So here are some of my favorite ways to play licks with arpeggios, just on a major 7 chord, we'll give examples of. So what you see here is you can just play up the arpeggio from the root, You can do it from the 7th, like what we see in Struttin' with Some Barbecue, and you can also get more inventive with it, like what you see in these 3rd and 4th little licks here. These little licks are so short that I actually like to call them bites. They're quick little snappy phrases, and if you learn them through the keys and internalize them, they're going to be really great little fragments of language that you can put together. All of the source material that we'll check out today, you can actually get a download of if you sign up for my jazz language course at Jazz Lesson Videos, which is an immaculate resource for jazz language with almost 5 hours of content and step-by-step guides for transcription, transposition, phrases, and application into improvisation. That course includes this Essential Bites PDF, which is about 50 pages of content on all these little phrase devices through the keys that we're going to check out today. And of course, with these arpeggios, you can also apply all these different shapes to different qualities and through the keys. Let's check out what it sounds like to apply these shapes to dominant and minor 7 chords. And so with arpeggios in mind, let's look at some Lester Young material, who of course was a master of swing era improvisation, who came onto the scene about 10 years after Louis Armstrong. So here in the second line of Lester Young's solo on the song Shoeshine Boy, we see a phrase that can actually be broken up into 3 parts and analyzed as 3 different licks, or bites as I like to call them. So the first bite in this lick is a downward arpeggio using 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 outlining a minor 7 chord. So Lester starts up on the 9, then plays the root down into the 7th, then the 5th, 3rd, and root again. Looking at our workbook of the Essential Bites PDF, we can actually see this is one of our downward minor arpeggio options. Then from there, we've got the second little bite to this lick, which goes like this. So this second little bite is the same note choice as St. Louis Blues. It's a 3-5-3-1 shape. Now, I'm sure Lester wasn't actually thinking about St. Louis Blues when he played this tiny little fragment, this tiny little bite here. But the point should be here that we're starting to see these connections of phrases between melodies. We're starting to find that some of the source material for these lines could actually be melodies. And so it makes sense when you're trying to improvise a spontaneous melody if you have source material that is written melody. So we're seeing connections of these phrases and written melodies that already exist in the jazz repertoire. This type of phrase I actually like to call a root riff. That's because it's essentially this quick little gesture of a lick or a bite here that lands on the root at the end, so it resolves really nicely. So there are a bunch of examples of root riffs in the Essential Bites PDF. Check these out for a reference of what we're adding to our pool of licks here to work from when we make this solo later on. Again, you're welcome to check out our resource to help you internalize these riffs through the keys, since these are really great mini language pieces to get memorized here. And the last component of Lester's lick here, the third component, is going to look familiar. It's actually just that strutting with some barbecue lick right there. Now for fun, let's jump way later in the timeline of jazz improvisation. Let's jump past bebop, which we're going to come back to in a second. And let's jump to post-bop. We're going to jump over to John Coltrane and his solo on the iconic song Giant Steps, which is filled with a bunch of 1, 2, 3, 4 and 1, 2, 3, 5 diatonic cell shapes through difficult chord changes. So in the first few bars of Trane's solo here, you'll see he's just using arpeggio notes and 4-note diatonic cells. So the most crucial diatonic cells to have down are again going to be these 1, 2, 3, 4 up a scale cells, as well as the 1, 2, 3, 5 cells. If we look at the first few bars here, we'll see everything here is just arpeggios as well as those diatonic cells. Other than arpeggios and diatonic cells, there are some slightly more full diatonic shapes that are really great to know. And a lot of these diatonic shapes can actually be traced back to melodies. You guessed it, melodies in the jazz repertoire, standards that are already written. Like for instance, one that people play a lot is the little bite lick of Honeysuckle Rose. So let's check out the list of diatonic shapes from the Essential Bites PDF, as well as some diatonic flurries that we can source from the bebop era, where the rhythm just gets a little bit more intricate. So speaking of the bebop era, now let's go back to Charlie Parker for some genius use of chromaticism. This is going to be our first time delving into chromaticism today. Coming out of the swing era, the main thing that bebop added to the music in terms of theory, in terms of what it was adding mechanically speaking, was it added a lot of chromaticism and a lot of rhythmic intricacy. The chromaticism got really hip in that there were these long chromatic enclosures and these strings of chromatic approach notes that would land on target notes. And as we saw in those last diatonic flurries, the rhythms got more intricate and the embellishments got a little faster, and there were these little flurries that they started playing. So again, Charlie Parker and the other pioneers of the bebop movement were really incredible, in adding in these chromatic connections. So let's check out an example of that on the song Yardbird Suite, and on Bird's solo, on Charlie Parker's solo on Yardbird Suite here. So Bird plays from, speaking in his key, an E7 to an A major 7 by jumping from the third of E7 up into a 3-note chromatic enclosure around what becomes the fifth of A major 7. And it's a lot easier to just think about this stuff as chromaticism that goes to a landing point. So in the Essential Bytes PDF, I have outlined a bunch of my favorite chromatic approach note and enclosure sets through the keys. So let's check out a bunch of my favorites in one key on C major 7. So again, if you want a reference for all this stuff and all these chromatic enclosures and approach notes you just saw, if you want a reference for all of it through the keys, it's going to be really great to internalize. Could be a great resource for you. And again, it's part of that jazz language course. Again, that course has almost 5 hours of content. It has a bunch of step-by-step guides for transposition, for transcription, for taking phrases and applying them to your improvisation. And we're still adding content to that course, so you can get in now for the lowest access price. The most recent thing that we added to it was this Essential Bytes PDF. And so with that resource, now let's take this big pool of licks that we have. We've got all these little licks. We've got everything from the diatonic flurries to the chromatic enclosures and the melodies that we took from earlier, like strutting with some barbecue and honeysuckle rose. Let's see if we can take all this content, this pool of licks here, and bring them together into a solo. So let's actually take a common chord progression. Let's go through the chord progression of There Will Never Be Another You, and we'll see if we can actually make a solo out of just using this, workbook of licks. All right, so in this solo that I just played, I actually used only material. I used exclusively material from that Essential Bytes grid workbook PDF, that we're looking at here. Every single phrase, we might have gone through some different keys of that stuff, but every single phrase here can be sourced in the material that's in that Essential Bytes PDF. Now, maybe it's not the best solo in the world. Maybe it feels a little bit planned out. But again, it's really fascinating how we can source all the material from the solo, which I'll break down in a second, and sort of shows how if you put all these mini licks together, you really can construct a convincing solo. All right, so as you see here, right off the bat, we start with that first phrase, which is just that strutting with some barbecue phrase, that first lick in the first measure. Then from there, we do chromatic approach notes down into the fifth of the F major. I'm speaking in my key, B flat tenor. Then from there, we just do a minor arpeggio down, and we're arpeggiating down D minor, which fits nicely in F major. From there, we arpeggiate up G minor, which fits very nicely in E half diminished 7. After the G minor 7 arpeggio, you're going to see that we play A, G, F, E, which is actually just a 1, 2, 3, 4 shape, but going in reverse, going down from that E half diminished 7 scale structure. So when you've got E half diminished 7, technically the scale that pairs with that as being your home base of that sound is going to be the Locrian scale, which is going to be built up E, F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E. And so we're just playing down from the 4. We're going 4, 3, 2, 1. Again, this comes from our Essential Bites workbook here. Then from there, after that, we've got a diatonic flurry, which is on that A7 flat 9 chord. After that, we've got a diatonic melody going down. This is the Cry Me a River lick. So this diatonic melody essentially comes from the song Cry Me a River, not the Justin Timberlake Cry Me a River, but the Cry Me a River from the American Songbook from the jazz tradition. From there, we have chromatic approach notes going down into the minor third of the C minor 7. Again, this is just an example of the chromatic approach notes that are in that Essential Bites workbook. From there, we arpeggiate up E flat major on C minor 7, or you could also think about it as being the 3rd, 5th, 7th, and 9th of the C minor 7, either way. Then we do a 1, 2, 3, 5 shape on C minor 7. Then we do another 1, 2, 3, 5 shape on F7. And then from there, we have chromatic approach notes that bring us down into a downward arpeggio from the root of that B flat major. Then after that, we've got a downward root riff on the E flat 7. Goes right into a chromatic enclosure on the F major and a 1, 2, 3, 5 shape. On that D minor, we've got another Cry Me a River lick. On the G7, we arpeggiate up from D minor, and then we do a chromatic approach into the 3rd of G7, getting into that next measure. Another chromatic approach going down, and then a chromatic enclosure around the G minor, around the root of G minor. Then after that, we just do the Cry Me a River lick, but we're doing it from G minor this time as opposed to D minor, which we were doing earlier. And right after that, we're just arpeggiating up 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 on the C7. From there, we do those root riffs on the F major 7 coming into the second half of the chorus. We do a couple of those. Then we're doing that St. Louis blues lick that we found in that Lester Young solo. That goes right into a G minor downward arpeggio right there, which fits really nicely on the E half diminished 7. And then we do a couple downward arpeggios on the A7 as well, just playing inside that A dominant sound. Then on the D minor, we do a 1, 2, 3, 5 shape inside that D minor, and then we go right into the Honeysuckle Rose lick, starting on beat 3 of that D minor measure. From there, we're doing chromatic approach notes down into the 3rd of C minor 7. We arpeggiate up from there, 3, 5, 7, 9. Then we go into another chromatic approach down into the F7. Again, all these chromatic approaches and enclosures we can find in that Essential Bites workbook. Then on the F7, we've got one of those diatonic flurries from the dominant 7 chord. Then we have another of those downward arpeggio shapes. This is, again, the second downward arpeggio bite from that Essential Bites workbook. This is a nice shape for B flat major, sits on a nice part of the horn. And then on the E flat 7, we've got another one of those diatonic flurries that we just had on the F7 a couple measures prior. And then we go into another diatonic flurry on that F major 7, another type in that next measure. From there, we're arpeggiating on the B half diminished 7. Then we're playing a nice set of chromatic approach notes on the E7 flat 9. We're doing a 1, 2, 3, 5 shape going down on the F major 7, a 1, 2, 3, 5 shape going up on the B flat major 7, a chromatic enclosure on the A minor 7 going into the D7, and then we have 2 root riffs in a row on that last 2/5, 2 measures before the end, to essentially cap off the chorus in a way that's very clear, a little bit bluesy melodic at the end there. Again, maybe it's not the best solo in the world, but it gives you an example of, in a very deliberate way, how licks can essentially be pieced together into a convincing solo. And soloing in this way might not sound like your dream of how you would want to improvise, but similar to learning a foreign language, when you first start speaking that language, sometimes you have to do it in a bit more deliberate of a way before you get really relaxed and free with speaking that language. So to summarize, is jazz just a bunch of licks? Well, a lick is just a short phrase of music. And if a style of music is like a spoken language, then it's almost like saying, is English just a bunch of words and sentences? The answer to that would obviously be yes. But to be able to learn the language of jazz and be able to improvise through it, similar to learning a new spoken language, takes a great deal of dedication to the craft. So often people get caught up with contemplation about results. Like, how will this help? What will this do? If I practice this exercise or phrase or transcription, how will it make me better? It's kind of like if you were given a bunch of sentences in a new foreign language that you were trying to learn, and you just looked at these sentences in this new foreign language and the translations of what they mean, and you were just like, well, how is this going to help me learn the new language? If you were given a sheet of sentences that will help you order food at a restaurant and navigate the restaurant setting with this new foreign language, you wouldn't question how it's going to help you. You would just know that you need to spend some time memorizing these phrases. So when you get to the restaurant, you can communicate that you want to ask for the steak, and you can say it with the proper pronunciation so the waiter will understand what you're saying to them. And then similar to a musical language, you also need to learn what it's going to sound like when someone speaks back to you, just like when someone plays something to you. So you can understand what they're saying and decide how you're going to respond. This, of course, is improvising in a spoken language when you do this, and the same applies for improvising through the language of jazz. So if you're given a sheet of quality phrases over a dominant 7 chord, for instance, instead of spending time and energy contemplating how it's even going to help you, spend that time and energy on internalizing it. See how much you can memorize from that content, and accept the fact that it's just some words in some sentences, and it's part of the bigger picture. And the more you do, the more you'll understand, and the more you'll be able to improvise successfully. Today, of course, we went over straight ahead jazz, but there's also different subcategories of jazz and different types of language: abstract jazz, fusion jazz. And, you know, the point being that, is jazz just a bunch of licks? Well, you know, in the sense of demeaning it to that level, of course, we wouldn't want to simplify it like that. But in the sense of the analogy that I made about it being a language, in that sense, yes, it is. It is just a bunch of licks, just like the language of French is just a bunch of words and sentences and pronunciations, and you have to study it deeply. So today we just talked about jazz improvisation in terms of the soloist, but there's also a whole set of languages that apply to comping in jazz improvisation, and the way that the rhythm section plays with the soloist is also improvised in jazz. And similar to the language of the soloist, there are also rhythmic figures and ways of walking bass lines, comping on the drums, comping on the piano. There are all these, sets of languages within the rhythm section as well. And before we wrap up today, I want to give a shout out to my 3 greatest mentors growing up learning how to play this music. I still have mentors today in what I learned from my peers, but growing up there are 3 people who were particularly influential in my development. One, of course, was my father, who always had recordings of jazz legends playing around the house on records as I grew up. That experience was really incredible to get the music in my ears. And he was a music teacher when he started me on saxophone. He got me right into improvisation because he recognized that was what I was most excited about. Number 2 was George Reed, who was a drummer who was based in Elmira, New York, near where I grew up. After spending much of his life in New York City, where he played with legends ranging from Teddy Wilson and even Charlie Parker, all the way to Marion McPartland, George spent most of his time towards the end of his life in Elmira, New York. He took me under his wing and had me playing with him consistently at a jazz club that was Black owned in Elmira, New York, called Green Pastures. I spent most of my childhood performing at this club and immersed in Black culture, learning how to play this music which comes from the Black American tradition. And this experience was absolutely essential for my growth as an improvising jazz musician. And finally, number 3, Joe Gilman, who is artistic director at the Brubeck Institute, where I went to college. His guidance on the inner workings of music was so thorough. I could never imagine having a greater teacher to give such comprehensive instruction on jazz and all forms of music during my college years, and I'm so grateful for that. So I hope that this process today helped you guys. Again, if you want to check out my jazz language course, would love to see you all over there. A lot of great content still coming into that course now. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching, guys.